For as long as we've had Fire Emblem, we've had Jagens. A Jagen is an early game pre-promote, usually a paladin, that starts off stronger than your other units but who gains experience at a slower rate compared to your other early game units. They usually also have lower growths, the idea being that your Jagen helps out a lot in the early game while you're learning the ropes, and eventually gets outpaced by the early game units that you train. The Jagen also often fills a mentor role for the Lord or some of the younger knights in your army. A lot of people make a distinction for Jagens with good growths, calling them oifis, but I don't like that term, so I'm going to be calling all of them Jagens. The problem with Jagens is that ideally they need to strike a really fine balance of feeling more powerful than your other units, but not breaking the game or incentivizing you not to use those other units. Part of the fun of Jagens is watching your growth units become stronger than them, so you don't want your Jagen to be so strong that it takes a long time for units to catch up, or maybe even never catch up. The prime example of this is Seth in Fire Emblem Sacred Stones, who will be your strongest unit for the vast majority of the game, if not the entire game. And you want to avoid that, because the point of the Jagen is to eventually be outpaced by your other units. You also want to avoid the Jagen being so strong that they just solo early game maps on their own. Units like Fire Emblem 7 Marcus dominate early maps so hard that you may not use any of your growth units. With the way these games work, you know that you're going to get higher level units later anyway, so there's little incentive to train some of your wimpy guys when Marcus or Seth can just dominate the maps on their own. So with that in mind, why do they even give us early game pre-promotes instead of just sticking us with the weaker growth units? I think, ideally, it's so that we have a unit that can support our project units and bail new players out of minor mistakes they make while they're learning the game. But when Jagens are so strong in the early game that they just dominate maps, they can actually make it tougher to learn the game because instead of learning concepts like using terrain or using the weapon triangle, you can just throw Jagen at all of your problems. So for new players, Jagens being so strong can actually hinder you from learning the game, and for more experienced players, really powerful Jagens can make the early maps feel totally trivial. Vander in Fire Emblem Engage is our most recent Jagen, and he manages to fill the most important functions of a Jagen without falling into some of the pitfalls that the more powerful Jagens do. Let's take a look at him. At the beginning of Engage, Vander will be your strongest unit. His strength may not be much higher than the others, but he has more defense than your early game units and way more HP. This is huge because a lot of your units can barely take a hit at this point in the game. In Chapter 3, units like Fram, Clan, and Etier often die if they take more than one hit. Vander is great in this chapter because he can handle 5+ combats with most enemies on the map, but he isn't strong enough to be one-rounding them on enemy phase, and he's not so tanky that he's indestructible. So you still feel like you want to involve your other units, and Vander doesn't trivialize any maps on his own. Crucially, Vander's lower strength actually helps him to do his job better than a lot of Jagens. A stronger Jagen like Seth would one-round every enemy he fights on enemy phase, leaving no EXP for your little project units. Vander just chunks them a little bit, leaving your other units to swoop in for the kills and experience. This makes Vander a much weaker unit than someone like Seth, but it makes him better for his role in the game, being a facilitator for early joining units without trivializing early chapters. Training units like Etier and Alir is a lot less daunting when you have a unit that can take a hit and deal solid chip in return. Vander can do this, but he's still weak enough that you want to use these other units. Vander can also bail a new player out of a difficult situation or make a tricky portion of a map a lot easier. Take Chapter 4. If a player is worried about all of the enemies to the south, Vander can take a couple hits and safely grab the village no matter what, and then his high move can help him catch up to the rest of your group if they went north. Alternatively, if a player sends a couple units out somewhere on their own and realizes they need help, Vander's high move relative to your other units helps him get there quickly to save the day. This is why it's good for Jagens to be high movement units. They can quickly get from place to place and relieve a lot of pressure, especially for a new player. And Vander fills some version of this role for a while. Units start to surpass him somewhat quickly, but he shouldn't fall out of your army until some point during or right after Brodia. But this is a good thing. Jagens are supposed to be outgrown, and they're supposed to either be benched or at least become a much less important member of your army. Their role as mentors in the story should extend to gameplay. They help our units grow so that they can carry the torch for the rest of the game. I've seen a lot of people mark Vander as one of the worst characters in Engage Maddening, but he's your most important character for a few chapters, one of the most important for a few more, and then serviceable for a few more after that. That's a lot better than some units in Engage, and importantly, it's unique. Even the best units in Engage can have their roles filled by other units. Panette is the best Vantage Wrath warrior, but there are other units that can fill that role. Higetsu is the best Wyvern, but Marin is still a great option. There's no adequate replacement for Vander. This doesn't make him a top tier unit, but I think it should count for a lot. A lot of units aren't even strong enough to see deployment after their join chapter, while Vander makes the early game so much more manageable and should be seeing deployment for at least 8 to 11 chapters. Vander may seem worse than some of the older Jagens that can just javelin or hand axe enemies down for the entire game, but that doesn't make Vander bad so much as it makes those Jagens too good or too powerful in the context of their games. Vander also does a really great job of communicating his role to new players by gaining almost no EXP when he gets a kill. It's immediately obvious that this isn't a unit you should be taking kills with, and is instead one you should be using to give kills to other units. And his strength being lower than typical Jagens means it's really easy for him to set up those kills for his buddies. Vander being an obviously poor long-term investment also makes him a safe character to experiment with. When you're playing Engage for the first time and you're trying to see which skills are good and what they do, you can always inherit one or two onto Vander and not really worry about wasting SP since Vander isn't going to be a forever part of your army anyway. So you can just throw skills on him and see how they work. For all of these reasons, I think Vander is one of the better designed Jagens we've had in the series. He does the job of a Jagen perfectly, and he does this while making the game more interesting and then fades into the background like he's supposed to instead of just carrying the entire game. Notably, I did say Vander is nearly perfect, and I do want to touch on the 3 small issues he has that I would change if I were redesigning Engage. One is that his personal skill is dumb. I was just raving about how Vander is perfectly designed to show players that he shouldn't take kills, and his low strength makes it easy to set up kills without accidentally taking one. With that in mind, it's baffling to me that his personal skill adds crit chance when standing next to a Leer. The crit chance is only 5%, so it's not high enough for you to plan around, but if you're not careful, sometimes Vander will snag a crit and kill an enemy that you wanted to feed to someone else. The occasional kill going to Vander isn't going to hurt the development of your other units, and you can be careful not to stand next to a Leer, so it's really not a big deal, but I just find it to be a strange personal skill to put on this unit. The second issue is sort of a side effect of weapon ranks being tied to class in Engage. Frequently, Jagens start off with a Silver Lance, and this basically allows them to kill a problematic enemy for you 20 times. Being able to one-round stuff makes previous Jagens great bailing you out of mistakes, but there was a cost associated because it meant the kill going onto the Jagen, and you didn't want to do it too much because the Silver Lance only had 20 uses, so you wanted to use it on difficult enemies or bosses rather than just Silver Lancing down every enemy on the map. In Engage, they didn't give us a Silver Axe in the base game, and I assume this was for 2 reasons. One is that weapon rank grinding isn't a thing in Engage. In most Fire Emblem games, units don't start off with the weapon rank to use silver weapons except for your Jagen, so you wouldn't have the option of, say, handing the Silver Lance to someone else. But in Engage, weapon ranks are tied to class, so if you gave Vander a Silver Axe, he would be able to hand it to Boucheron, for example. The other issue is that weapons don't break in Engage and have infinite durability, so in most games, giving you an early Silver Lance is a temporary boost in power because eventually the Silver Lance is going to break. If you give the player a Silver Axe in Engage, they don't have to worry about weapon durability since weapons don't break in Engage. This means you could use the Silver Axe against every enemy on the map and you would never have to worry about it breaking like you do in previous Fire Emblem games. Regardless of the reason though, Vander doesn't have a Silver Axe and this means he can't swoop in and kill a tricky enemy like previous Jagens can. However, I don't think this is the end of the world in Engage because Engage gives us a different early game kill an enemy button in the form of the Marth emblem. Marth's Engage attack is basically a delete enemy button in the early game, and that being there means that Vander doesn't really need to fill this role. Vander's last issue is that his accuracy can be pretty shaky with the axes he starts with. This isn't an unforgivable flaw for most units, but I do think it's a problem for a Jagen. A Jagen is supposed to be a safety valve for new players and a way to feed kills to other units, and for both of these tasks, consistency is key. And this issue is solvable by putting a plus 10 hit skill on him or by handing him a compact axe. And throwing a skill on Vander isn't a huge deal since you don't need to save the SP because you aren't going to use him long term anyway. But I still think him being more accurate out of the box would have been a nice thing for Engage, especially for the early chapters where you haven't had a chance to buy him a new axe or get a skill on him yet. Despite these few issues, I think Vander fills his role in Engage almost perfectly, and it shows in how the early maps play. When you watch Sacred Stones or Blazing Blade gameplay, you're gonna see a lot of Seth and Marcus destroying early game maps, often on their own or with just one or two other units helping. It gets to the point where there's not much thought involved in playing the chapters, and you're just waiting for the chapters to get hard enough that your Jagen isn't your solution to every problem anymore. In contrast, Engage's early game is a lot more interesting. I rarely see people trying to Vander solo maps. Instead, they're encouraged to use more of their army and get some experience on the lower level troops. I actually think about what moves I'm making in early game Engage maps instead of just throwing my Jagen at all of my problems. Unfortunately, the rest of Engage isn't as kind to early game growth units as Vander is, and perhaps this is part of why the perception of him isn't great. Even if you don't want to train any early game units but a Lear though, Vander is a godsend for getting through early maps when so many of your units are about as durable as tissue paper. To me, Vander should be the model for future Jagens. He makes the game easier without trivializing it, helps train and protect your weaker units, and then fades gracefully into the background as new members of your army replace him. That's what Jagens should do, and Vander does it well. But what do you think a Jagen's role in a Fire Emblem game should be? Which ones do you think perform that role well? I'd love to hear what you think in the comments, and if you enjoyed the video, consider hitting the like or subscribe button so that you never miss an upload. And if you want to chat more about Fire Emblem, consider joining the community Discord linked in the video description. We do a lot of Fire Emblem discussion, drafting, and polls about the channel there, so give that a look if you're interested, and have an awesome week.